So, good afternoon in Sweden, good morning in Colombia, and hello to everybody all around the world. Thanks for viewing us. Welcome to this webinar that FormSud is organizing about defending human rights in Colombia and the role Sweden can play in such a context. I am Carlos Cardenas, Communications and Advocacy Officer at the FormSud Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. We're here in Bogota, and I will be moderating today's conversation. Today, we will be talking with Francisco Gutiérrez. He's also here in Bogota, in Colombia. He is director of the Land Restitution Observatory in Colombia. He's a researcher and professor also at the National University of Colombia. Good morning, Francisco, and thanks for being with us today.
Good morning, Carlos. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we also have with us today Annika Otterstedt. She is currently the Deputy Director at Sida, the Swedish International Development Agency. She has also some experience living in Colombia. She was also part of Sida here at the Swedish Embassy in Colombia for around 3 years, if I'm not wrong. So Annika, welcome, and thank you also for being today with us.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Francisco and Annika, we will have several rounds of questions for both of you, but also feel free to comment on each other's answers. If in any case you want to reply or add something to each of you will be sharing with us. Of course, I will try to keep control of time as we don't have that much time to expand and talk about so much thing that we could be talking today. So please be patient with me when I'll have to ask you to cut down a little bit and try to close up your answers. And before we start, we also want our viewers to know that we will be reading your questions and comments on our social media, on YouTube, on Facebook, and also on FormSud Colombia's Facebook page, where we are streaming this webinar. And we will try to have some time at the end of this talk to share some of those questions and comments with Francisco and Annika. So getting into it, I would like first that we can talk a little bit about the human rights defenders and environmental defenders situation in Colombia, which is not something that is unknown for most of the world. For the last decades and years, Colombia has been considered the deadliest country for human rights defenders and for social leaders and environmental leaders. For example, according to Indepaz, a Colombian NGO that follows these statistics, only for this year, 2020, we have until last Friday an account of 110 human rights defenders and social leaders that have been murdered, and that makes it up to almost one murder per day. And for example, for ex-combatants of the Farc ex-guerrilla that signed a peace agreement on 2016 with the Colombian government, only in this year we've had 25 of these people murdered, which makes about one every 5 days. So statistically, it's a tragedy. And right now, with the virus that is making the whole world and also Colombia, of course, being in a struggle to deal with that, I would like to ask first to Francisco, how is the situation for human rights and environmental and social defenders in Colombia amid the global pandemic? And do these threats and violence toward those who are defending their rights remain high? And what has been the impact of this whole pandemic situation?
Well, as you said, the situation was already very precarious before the start of the COVID-19 crisis. I think that the crisis has added 5 dimensions or 5 new dynamics to the problem. First of all, armed groups and criminals maintained their mobility while social leaders remained as fixed targets. So they are being tracked down much more easily. Second, contentious events take place without the presence of the press and frequently without the presence of state agencies, which uh, are in charge of defending social leaders. So there are much less people observing the killing of the leaders. Third of all, there is less opportunity to protest with the crisis and with the isolation. Of course, the streets and taking to the roads is not an option for people who would want to protest or mobilize against certain acts. In fourth place, the government has continued with fumigations and forced eradication. So peasants linked to illicit crops are in a particularly difficult situation. In fifth and last but not least, the crisis has opened regulatory opportunities for non-state armed groups, in the sense that they are, in some regions, they are taking in their hands the lockdown, and they are promoting draconian measures against people who are violating the lockdown. So I think these five factors have made even more precarious the situation.
Thank you, Francisco. Yeah, and definitely there are some things there that will be related also to the peace agreement implementation, and we can talk a little bit more about that further on. Annika, as I said, you worked for 3 years at the Swedish Embassy in Bogota, and now you have been in Sweden, in Stockholm, back for around 2 years. Uh, can you, from Sida's horizon and point of view, share with us how this violence towards human rights and environmental and social defenders has escalated in Colombia? What are your views on the situation and Sida's views on the situation?
I think that it is actually more difficult now to see what is happening out in the region, since, as we've heard, it's more difficult to do the practical follow-up for the embassy in all the different regions, since we cannot travel. I think thanks to the support and the cooperation Sweden, through the Swedish embassy and through Swedish civil society, has had for such a long time, for decades, I think that we do receive a lot of information and therefore have a pretty good picture of the challenges that people, women and men, and organizations have out in certain regions, such as Chocó, Tomaco, Arauca, Norte de Santander, in a lot of places. I think what we can do is, of course, continue supporting those organizations that actually do have local activities in conflict-prone areas, to ensure that at first they receive the support they need to be able to at least raise their voices towards local politicians, but also towards local armed groups, which is not at all easy. But sometimes there is at least some sort of communication between the different parties. I also think it is very important for Sweden to continue transmitting information that we do receive from our partners, to tell the world around Colombia, to tell people in Sweden what the situation is like when you do not have the opportunity to speak up, when you do not have the capacity to have an impact on your local life, where a lot of other actors do have an impact which you do not appreciate, really. I think another thing we can do is to support local institutions to strengthen the capacity of state actors and local institutions in the regions to provide for sustainable infrastructure and sustainable services such as health and education, which is also a prerequisite for people to be able to stay there and to improve their knowledge of their rights, and also their health, so that they actually can participate in political decisions and in local peace building dialogue. So I think we can do a lot of things that we normally do, but of course it is very scary that things have gotten worse during this very specific situation, and that is, of course, as we heard, because the mobility is lower, and therefore the access to the most conflict-prone areas is less accessible, which leaves people in those areas unprotected by the international community, by the Colombian state, and by actors which are actually there to support them. And I think that is something that is needed to be addressed in the coming months.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And it's a huge challenge to see how this really can be done. Also, because we have seen how many support and aid from the international community, sometimes it's not really reaching the purposes that it is aiming to. So that's a huge challenge also. Francisco, we know that you're a researcher on these matters, and I personally admire the work you've done regarding the Colombian conflict and the dynamics of the social and armed conflict in Colombia. What would you say are the driving forces behind this violence towards human rights defenders and social leaders? Who are those perpetrators behind all that? And also, what do the Colombian government needs to do in order to put an end to this, if it was possible to think about something like this? And also the international community, you might have some ideas on how the international community can be part of solving or finding alternatives to these problems.
Many thanks, Carlos. Uh, Allow me to be completely candid, okay? So I I think that the situation is very confusing. We have actually a big mess regarding definitions, regarding counting methods, etc., etc. And I frankly believe that the messiest of all definitions are those coming from the states, because they conceal a lot of the dynamics. Uh, for example, by classifying all the non-state armed groups as narco traffickers. So the successor groups of the paramilitaries, etc., have been classified simply as narco traffickers, trying to deny that they have any political character, which I think is fundamentally flawed. So we at the Observatorio, with different teams, have made a careful count of one category of leaders, a single category of leaders, because we thought that over that category we relatively could control which cases went in and which cases didn't go in, which is rural social leaders. And regarding rural social leaders, so I must stress it's only this category. Yeah. So there are a lot of other categories that don't go in. So regarding social leaders, I will not put the graphs that I prepared for this seminar, because I don't want to lose time. But as you said, Carlos, the phenomenon has grown continually with a slope of between 3 and 4. That means that every single year, 3 or 4 additional leaders are killed in relation with the previous year. At least one rural leader, but there are much more, is being killed weekly. And I have to say, if the tally of perpetrators is cleaned, then you have uh, three basic conclusions. First of all, the main of the events have no known perpetrator. So they can be local actors or people who simply don't identify themselves for one reason or another. Second, among the known perpetrators, by far and large, the main one is successor groups from the paramilitaries. Groups like the so-called Clan del Golfo, which is basically the Urabeños, autodefensas, gaitanistas, self-defenses, uh, also the Pachenkas, etc., etc. Second conclusion, and this applies to every period, to every year, the participation of the state as perpetrator is non-negligible. It's relatively high, actually. So, for example, in the periods 2016, 2020, there were 214 cases without identification, 33 of them, 33 cases that can be attributed to successor groups, and 10 cases to the state. In the 20th of May, for example, there was a killing of a leader in Anorí, Antioquia, that Noticias Uno transmitted. There are several of these cases, and probably there is an underestimation, actually. So, what we can say about the dynamics, I think, is basically that indeed there's an issue regarding the capture of rents. However, this cannot be reduced to the presence of illicit crops. Actually, with our team, with Margarita Marina and Diana Machuca, we threw a couple of regressions, and coca only appeared very occasionally in the models as a significant variable. The main significant variables were to be a PEDET municipality, that is a municipality target for the for peace funds, and on the other hand, having the presence of successor groups near. Second, there are also a lot of local conflicts which are fueling the assassination of social leaders. And also, there are a lot of regulatory changes and readaptations in the sense that new groups are forming in the regions. And of course, this creates a lot of contentious relationships between those groups and the population, and among those groups for the preeminence in the region. So there's a reconfiguration of the non-state armed sector, and all this has played into the dynamics. And the last thing is that the state pushed leaders to participate in peace programs, and after that they undercut those peace programs, and they didn't provide a, a modicum of security to those leaders. So the very state has put them highly in risk, as can be shown happen with the process of substitution of illicit crops.
Yeah, yeah. And in your answer, I can understand between lines how talking about the state taking measures is something that goes beyond the whole context analysis and the whole situation, as the state has very relevant and serious responsibilities on negligence, but also on activeness in some of the things that are been going on and aggravating the situation. Yes?
Let me tell you this, Carlos.
Uh-huh.
There are many states in Colombia, many states. So some states protect, but other states kill. And this is not a thing of the past. So I think it has to be said very clearly and very simply. There are sectors of the state who are still killing social leaders, and here you can show it in the counts. By the way, these figures and these data which I am giving you are completely public. You can access the micro data at the webpage of the observatory, and everybody can say this is true, this is not true. So this is pretty much public data.
Mhm. Yeah, and Annika, facing that situation and that harsh reality that we're living in Colombia with this different positions in tension and in conflict that the state has been having, what can international governments and funders, in general, international community to cooperate in Colombia, how can, and specifically in your case, Sweden, how can this situation be addressed? The threats and violence towards social leaders, as Francisco stressed, mainly rural social leaders, ethnic social leaders, many times. How can this be dealt with when you have this complexity in the Colombian state?
I think in several ways. I think it first by understanding different perspectives of different groups, as we had, that coexist in all the regions, and also the the arm of the state, the Bogota presence in certain regions. I mean, by trying to arrange meetings, doesn't have to be physical meetings, but try to link different perspectives with one another, supported by an attitude of reconciliation from the international community. I think that is something that we can do together with not the least the civil society, which is both Colombian and international. I also think that we can support the Colombian government, but not the least local authorities in strengthening the capacity to deliver services. Because I think that in many regions there is a lack of trust towards the government at all levels, because many people have never seen the deliveries of the government. They have not they have not been reached by the services of health or education or infrastructure, which means that what they have seen of the government is the military part. And of course, I think that if you want to decrease violence in many parts of Colombia, you have to have a state presence, which is a broader perspective of the state, meaning all the sectors which should provide services to the people of the country. And I think that would also decrease the dependence on local actors, which are more of the violent character. And as we heard, I think that many people do take part in perhaps illegal activities because they have no other choice as it is now. So what is there for many people is illegal mining or illegal cultivation of illegal crops, which is not good. But if you have no other opportunities to survive as a family, then that is what you will do. So I think what the international community can do is to support. One thing is support the infrastructure to enable private sector and the state to be present and to try to establish new companies, rural banks, strengthen communities so that the local groups there can also put pressure on local authorities in terms of how they would like to see the development in their communities. So I don't think that we can impose anything, but there are several interesting projects, I think, financed by Sweden. One is through the municipalities organization in Sweden, which is working in 6 different municipalities in Colombia with a bottom-up approach to try to support strengthening the local authorities' capacity to provide actually what people living in that municipality want to have. But then, of course, you have all the groups which do not live in any sort of a municipality. They live out in the forests or in the mountains, and they are much more dependent on the actors being present there. So I think that the international community can also, of course, support the UN organizations working on human rights, for example, and we can always push for a human rights perspective in all the dialogue with the different actors, the government as well as other actors. But we also need to financial-wise support the strengthening of local organizations and municipalities, because that is the way that they can then put pressure from below to the top on their own development. I think that the international community can support people living everywhere in Colombia to take lead on their own development. But it also has to be done in a peaceful way by listening to different perspectives and also acknowledging that people from different parts of Colombia, from different sectors, from different classes, they have different perspectives. And it is by listening and by trying to understand the different perspectives that you also can change development in a peaceful way. But of course, since the power relations are so different, this requires a specific emphasis on the groups, on people, women, men, children, youth, who do not today have a strong voice. and who are not today able to convey their understanding of development and their wishes. So I think that is where the international community can also support Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. I would like to move on to.
Carlos,
Okay, Francisco. Yeah, you
you know,
wanna
no,
comment something? Yeah.
I would want simply to provide two suggestions because the situation is really dramatic and the killings have proliferated. So, one suggestion would be to take a decentralized approach in the sense that different sectors of the international community, especially in Europe, adopt social organizations here and start to take care of protection. So, so an organization or an academic in Sweden starts establishes a direct link with an organization in risk here in Colombia, and they start to interact. And the second one is that there is some pressure, and I think would be reasonable enough, is put on the government or kind of interaction also with the peace commission of the two chambers of the Congress to establish an independent report, a kind of white book. It can be biannual, something like that, regarding the killing of social leaders. Listen, given the constellation of forces in Colombia and the long-standing dynamics of the Colombian conflict, as Carlos was saying, the only way to stop this bloodletting is to increase the political costs of the killers. And as I was telling you, it, of the killings, and as I was telling you, a lot of those killings take place in the dark. They are not very well identified, etc., etc. So I deeply believe that if there is an independent report published in a sort of white book, etc., coordinated by the Colombian Congress, eventually the government and the international community, something a kind of biannual, maybe with the ombudsman, the Defensoría del Pueblo. I think that this would uh, be hugely important and could have a definite positive impact in the situation. So I would my 5 cents would be, on the one hand, contribute to establish a direct relationship between organizations in risk and personalities and groups in the academy and the defense human rights sectors in Europe, and on the other hand, start actively promoting an independent report under the umbrella of different sectors of the international community with the Colombian participation, as Annika was saying, with different sectors speaking in that report, so that the political costs of continuing in this path increase radically for the people who are visible.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting proposal, Francisco. We should follow up on that because I agree that increasing the political cost of the killings of leaders in Colombia is something that strongly can be worked on as a strategy in different ways, and this is a very interesting one. I would like to move on to another topic, and it's more the impact of this pandemic and the lockdown that we're living in Colombia, related more to the informal sector and to those vulnerable communities that live mainly from informal economies, which is basically 50 to 70% of the Colombian population in the main cities, at least. So many people are being impacted on their income. They base their income on a daily basis, and this has been severely affected by the quarantine. So many people are not able to sustain their families anymore. We see problems with the Venezuelan migrants, with street vendors, like people that live on these informal economies. And also, the rural communities in more remote areas are being particularly vulnerable to the whole situation, as the distribution of the goods they are producing is limited and restricted. Uh, Francisco, can you tell us a little bit more about this impact of the lockdown and the curfews on some regions, sometimes established under these draconian measures that you mentioned from non-state actors, most of the times armed actors? What has been the impacts on people involved in these informal economies, like those vulnerable uh, communities of different kind in the cities, but also rural?
Well, Carlos, let me be very prudent because obviously have not studied this.
Hmm.
So, that's my first take would be: first of all, there are tens of thousands of women living dangerously because their partners are wife batterers and they are exposed to domestic violence, but at the same time they are locked down. So here we have a huge issue which has not been addressed properly. Of course, in big cities, there are policies. For example, Claudia Lopez here in Bogota has developed an explicit policy. Of course, this policy has to be evaluated to see how good it is, etc., etc. But at least you see a policy out there.
Hmm.
But in weaker municipalities, and you were speaking at the beginning, Carlos, about intermediate cities. These are very, very important in Colombia, and I am not so sure that there is something analogous in intermediate cities. So that would be a first point. The second issue is that, as you say, there there is a massive informal sector in Colombia, which uh, which is in a very difficult position because basically its access to base to its basic sources of livelihood has been cut off. So so this can this can take a long, long, long time. Uh, yeah, yeah. So let's say we would need much more vigorous social policies. We would need a much more imaginative approach, etc., etc. And the third thing is that let's say, there is a big overlap between territorial and class variables, in the sense that the most vulnerable people uh, live in excluded social sectors and in excluded social regions.
Hmm.
So let's say the state should develop specific policies targeted to those people.
Yeah, and definitely here would be an important field of action for the international community to support this new aggravated situation we're having with the pandemic in Colombia and in Latin America. As we know now, the World Health Organization is already talking about Latin America as the new epicenter of the pandemic. So that would be something to talk about. Unfortunately, Annika had to leave us. She only had 30 minutes for our webinar. We wanted to be restrictive and really rigorous on time, but unfortunately, there's too much to talk about here. So she excuses herself. She already had a compromise um, at this moment, so she had to leave us. But we can still talk a little bit with Francisco, especially getting into a topic that I know that you are very into it and have worked a lot on it. And it's you've been talking already a little bit about this, and it's about the peace agreement, its implementation, and the peace programs in the Colombian context. Uh, we've seen here in Colombia that there have been contradictory versions of how the implementation of the peace agreement between the Colombian government and Farc has been going. On one side, we have civil society organizations, human rights groups, research centers, observatories, just like your observatorio, which have stated in different ways that there are several problems with the implementation. Uh, on the other hand, the government is saying that the implementation is following a satisfactory path in general. That's like the solid argument they state every time they have to reply on reports or on the research that have been published by the civil society in Colombia. Francisco, how can there be such a different view and such opposed versions of what is going on with the peace programs and the implementation of what was agreed between the government and the FARC?
Eh, this is a difficult one because I am not a great friend of strong words, but in this case, I would say that to argue that the Colombian peace process has gone forward positively is completely unreasonable. The peace process is in shambles. I think that any kind of evaluation, of serious evaluation, would arrive to the same conclusion. And even, for example, institutes which used to report very positively about the process, like the Kroc Institute, have started to uh, cut down their enthusiasm because obviously the peace process is going very poorly. So to explain the difference of evaluations, I think one should understand the underlying politics of the peace process. So uh, I think that let's say regarding the peace process and the agreement between the government and the FARC in 2016, in November 2016, there are basically like four positions in the Colombian political space. So the first one is kind of rescue it or push it forward. By the way, this is not only a province of the left. There are a lot of people in the center who have adopted this position. Second, adapt it and neutralize it. So, for example, people in a party called Cambio Radical would want to limit its rough edges, what they consider dangers, for example, for entrepreneurs and for the military. But at the same time, if this is limited, they would be willing to push forward some of its agreement. The third position, which is the position more or less officially adopted by the government party, is to destroy it, uh, shred it apart, to be literal, hacerlo trizas.
Mhm.
And the fourth position, which is the position of the government, is dismounted gradually, minimizing the consequences of doing so. And why has the government adopted this policy? Because, first of all, the international costs of destroying it are too high, uh, vis-a-vis not only Europe but even the United States in many senses. And
Mhm.
second of all, the government doesn't even have majorities in the Congress, so it has to attract some actors, and these actors would find sectors from the center parties, as the traditional center parties, as Partido de la U and Cambio Radical, etc. And many of these parties would, let's say, would not be willing to publicly say we will embark in a course of destruction of the peace process. So what they are, what the government is trying to do, and besides, before the COVID crisis, the support of the government by public opinion was very, very low. As you remember, Carlos, it
Yeah,
was ranging between 20 and 30%,
yeah.
depending on the moment and the survey enterprise and the polling enterprise. So due to this, the government has been maneuvering, on the one hand, pushing forward the government agenda, and all this I can substantiate in detail, but I know that we are short on time, and I also have to leave at night, so we have limits. All this can be substantiated in minute detail, and and unfortunately, the situation has uh, been very opaque in the sense that a lot of actors who want to push forward the peace agreement in Colombia, who want to support the peace agreement in Colombia, have taken the position, which is completely understandable, of saying, okay, this government is hinting that it really wants to implement the agreement. Uh, it's not completely against it, so let's try to push it in the positive direction without raising any kind of criticism, etc., etc. And that strategy could have had some positive consequences, etc. But I think nowadays it's completely clear that that strategy is not yielding positive results. And I think the international community and other pro-peace actors have
Mhm.
to start craft another approach towards the hostility. I think that quite open, quite evident of the Colombian government towards this real existing peace.
Mhm. And what would be that other approach that you?
Short of declaring war, I, I know. I think there's a lot of ways, actually, even of interacting with the Colombian government, but over the basis of genuinely supporting the peace process.
Mhm.
So I would think at least on three options, trying to develop uh, the propositive imagination that that in in Colombia we don't have it so terribly developed, and it's an exercise we have to do. So I think the first one is uh, going very much in the direction of what Annika was saying before she left,
Yeah.
pushing forward forms of peace conditionality.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of municipalities, etc., who want to participate in the peace process, uh, who are willing to push forward the original agreement, and who have a long tradition of peace mongering. So I would believe that if the international community came with some funds, etc., some not only funds but with expertise, with legitimacy, saying we want to work also very strongly with the municipalities and see step by step how can we push forward the capacities to promote peace.
Mhm.
That would be very positive. It had a positive impact in Central America, in the previous Yugoslavia. As you know, there's a lot of literature about this. So peace conditionality programs can be very positive in this context. But of course, the idea is not to short circuit the government, but rather to create conditions at the subnational level so that this can simply take its own dynamics. The second issue, which I think fundamental, is to uh, interact both with the government and the Congress to create programs for the protection of social leaders and for the protection of Farc ex-combatants. This is hugely important because, as you were highlighting, a lot of leaders and of ex-combatants, which are completely different categories, but anyways, they are at risk. They are
Mhm.
being killed. If uh, if we don't pay attention to this, we will end up with a tragedy like the one of the Unión Patriótica, with thousands of people killed and a whole political denomination destroyed. So I think that there should be, let's say, urgent protection measures. I think that from the legitimacy point of view, if these proposals are made public, it's very difficult to say no.
Mhm.
So if a public initiative of protection issued by the international community is announced and tries to involve the government, social leaders, etc., this would raise radically the costs of killing people, and at the same time would improve our knowledge base to to understand what is happening and to know better how to protect the people. So I think this is a second, let's say,
Mhm.
quite fundamental issue. And the third question is to maybe identify some key drivers of change, not all the agreements, because nobody has the power simply to
Mm.
help in all the fronts, but some basic drivers of change aside from protection, because obviously nobody can participate if I want to participate and I am being shot at. Uh, this is an ongoer. But apart from this, some two or three basic drivers of change within the peace agreements that can be systematically promoted, and not only promoted but followed up in detail, uh, to evaluate how well and how genuinely different actors are developing this agreement. So
Yeah,
so I think that these are three relatively fertile areas where the international community can help the Colombian peace process.
yeah. I agree with you, Francisco, and definitely, even though we have limited time, and of course, unfortunately, we didn't have Anika to share with us some additional insights of how the international community, and specifically Sweden, can be promoting. She still shared some things that are very in the same line that you are mentioning right now on these peace conditionality programs and support. Uh, and I also agree that there's definitely a lot to be done in terms of bringing these new ways of increasing the political cost of killings. The white report you mentioned, that's some concrete idea, and how this has to be also engaged, uh, bringing like the commitment of political sectors in Colombia, even though we know that the government might be a complex, it has a complex configuration where it has the different trends that you mentioned that go to the most radical peace shredding fanatics, to the ones that just want to make a more subtle implementation. And also these basic drivers of change, I think it has to do a lot also with what Annika was saying. And it, in my opinion, it deals a lot with strengthening these efforts for reconciliation, for bringing the truth of what has been happening, of understanding our own history and the regional micros histories that have been going on in the country, as a step that can bring
Let me
a
let me,
situation.
Carlos,
Yeah,
say the word land, bloody land.
yeah.
So if, for example, in certain regions, access to land can be pushed forward, yeah, because it is incredible. This was like one of the core issues, and it's not even named nowadays. So of course this cannot be promoted nationally, etc. It would be very complicated, but at least in some regions, this is unblocked, and this issue of access of land is unblocked, and we can see what happens with that, with that outcome, and how things evolve. That this is a public signal, yeah.
Mhm.
So I think land is a really fundamental
Yeah,
issue. Of course, this is one of my obsessions. So,
yeah.
but
But in Colombian history, it can be highlighted also as the big issue that has been making us fall once and again in this conflict. Francisco, we need to wrap up, but then I would like just to share one question that we have in our chat. I have to mention that we have people watching us from Colombia, of course, from Cincelejo. We have Alejandrina, and also we have people watching us from Sweden, from Finland. I know that also from Kenya, people are watching us. And we have a question from Benjamin. I don't know how to pronounce its surname, Benjamin Toko. He's asking what has been the role so far of regional actors in sustaining the peace agreement. If you have maybe some insights on that particular comment.
it has been very mixed. So in some cases, both regional and local authorities, for example, have participated very strongly and enthusiastically in the peace process. Of course, a lot of them are applying to or applied in its moment to participate in the PEDET, etc. But it's not only this passive role of applying for participation in different national programs associated to the peace process. Many of them have unleashed their own ideas and have participated with local and regional actors to promote peace. So precisely it is in this context, with this very differential response to peace, where peace conditionality programs can have a very positive role.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, Francisco. I think time is up for now. We thank you very much for being today. Also, of course, we thank Annika for the time she had with us today. And we want to know our viewers that these are issues that Forum Sud is working on actively, and we will continue to address the situation for human rights in Colombia, the peace agreement implementation in our country, and other situations in the region as well. We will be holding more events on different perspectives on these issues, and so keep your eyes open for that. And thank you, Francisco, and see you on another occasion, hopefully. Um,
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to Syd, SYD.
Thank you very much, and everybody take care and bye.